evening. My name is Stacy Blakeley. I am the Executive Director of the Policy Circle. This evening, we are covering a topic that actually came to our attention in September. With the sudden withdrawal from the United States from Afghanistan, we saw a rapid influx of refugees. So we began preparing a brief on this topic. And then since that time, we have seen the events unfold in Ukraine and a refugee crisis that is the most we have seen in Europe since World War II. With these two converging crises on our sort of radar, we started to look at the broader picture of what's going on with refugees around the world. And most importantly, what can we do to respond to the humanitarian crisis while at the same time identifying ways that we can help refugees once they resettle in the United States to not only survive what has to be a horrific ordeal, but to thrive and become a vibrant part of our communities. The format for our Move the Needle today is a bit different. We have gathered some diverse perspectives on this, and due to everyone's busy schedules, we have decided to record a few of these in advance. We're excited to hear from people that can give us a perspective on both the situation in Ukraine, Afghanistan, and then also what we can do right here in our own communities. Next, we're joined by Jennifer Simon. She's the Senior Director for Advocacy and Community Engagement at the USA for UNHCR, the U.S. national partner of the UN Refugee Agency. Prior to this role, Jennifer served as Senior Vice President of Edelman's Social Impact Practice. She also formerly served in the White House as Director of International Affairs and Senior Policy. She brings excellent perspective and expertise in global gender equity, development, and humanitarian issues. In your role with USA for UNHCR, which that's the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, right? That's what that acronym stands for.
The UN Refugee Agency, yep.
Yeah, can you share sort of what the magnitude of the current humanitarian crisis is right now? I think we see some numbers floating around, but can you give us a sense of historically where we stand?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Stacy, for that question. And even more importantly, thank you for convening this briefing today on the UN refugee crisis. In terms of a overarching number, last year, 2021, more than 84 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide because of persecution, conflict, or violence. This is the highest number of forcibly displaced we have seen in history. This is the global number of people that fall under the UN Refugee Agency's protection mandate. And this number of 84 million is an increase of 1.6 million people from 2020. This is also, I mentioned, the highest number in history. And I think it's also important to recognize that this is also a trend that we have been seeing year over year, a very unfortunate, a very tragic trend. Every year, the UN agency in June issues its annual report of the state of the global refugee crisis. And this number has been ticking up year over year. So 84 million is where we currently are globally.
And is that number pre-Ukraine?
It is. I can break that down a bit for you. I've been saying or using the term forcibly displaced. And as we talk about 84 million, that is really three groups of people that I also think are important to understand the distinctions between the three. The first are what we often think of very commonly as forcibly displaced refugees. There are currently about 26.5 million. Of that number are refugees. The distinction is that a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee their home because of war, violence, or persecution, and they have crossed a border into a neighboring country. That is the distinction that makes them refugees under international law. 68% of our current refugees in the world come from 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. The second group I'll talk about are internally displaced people, or IDPs. And this is actually the largest number of people that fall under that 84 million, that fall under the protection mandate. This is 51 million. An IDP is a person who also has been forced to flee their home because of violence, conflict, war, sometimes natural disaster, and they've not crossed a border into another country. So they're internally displaced, still within their home country. The countries that currently have the largest number of internally displaced people are Yemen, Syria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Colombia. And then finally, the third group I'll mention of the 84 million are asylum seekers. This is when people also have been forced to flee their country. They're seeking safety, they're seeking sanctuary in another country, and they apply for asylum, which is the right to be recognized as a refugee. And to be recognized as a refugee, one must demonstrate their fear of persecution. So these are people forced to flee their homes and have not yet been designated as refugees. And that's about 4.5 million people currently. So specific to your original question, that total of 84 does not include the mass movements we have seen from people fleeing violence in Ukraine in the past month. And that's about 5 million people that have crossed borders and 7 million people who are internally displaced in Ukraine. So we can add, roughly another 11 million people just in the past 8 weeks alone.
Yeah, it's an incredible number when you consider the magnitude of this challenge. And so what is the role of the UNHCR as it relates to refugees?
Sure. There's really a lot I could say here. I'll really focus today in 4 areas. The first is emergency relief, and it is the images I'd say that people most often think of, the kind of work and response that people most often think of in humanitarian crises. And that is in any emergency, in any large-scale, rapid movement of people who have been forced to flee, as is happening now in Ukraine. UNHCR sends emergency life-saving relief supplies and deploys staff anywhere in the world at any given time. UNHCR is able to deploy within 72 hours of a large-scale emergency and jumpstart relief and protection assistance. And in emergencies such as these, that assistance often looks like what people need to survive: shelter, medical care, food, water, special protection and care for vulnerable women and children. So that's the first area I'll cover. The second is an area of support that is newer to UNHCR and newer to humanitarian response, and that's cash assistance. Those who are forced to flee in emergencies, as you can imagine, any emergency, people often leave with the clothes that are on their back, the money they have in their pocket, maybe a suitcase, if they're lucky. And so 85% of refugees don't live in refugee camps. And so having some type of reliable income, whether it's a situation in which they're able to work or whether they're able to receive cash assistance, that becomes really critical to their survival. Cash assistance, the needs, of course, really vary country by country and community by community, but the global average is about $185 can help a family to pay rent or to purchase food. And cash assistance is really very important because it retains the dignity of choice. Families and people who are forced to flee know best what they need to support themselves, to support their loved ones. And so this allows them to make that choice, to put cash toward rent or buy food or medicine. And this approach also infuses money into local economies. And then the final 2 areas I'll talk about briefly that UNHCR supports are education and livelihoods. So cash assistance and humanitarian relief really come into play in the days and weeks and immediate months after someone is forced to flee. Education and livelihoods are also very critical in more protracted or longer term situations where people aren't able to return home. More than half of the world's refugees are under 18 years old. And so, we can see that without access to any form of education, that generation's future is really put at risk. So UNHCR works to enroll refugee children in countries, dozens of countries around the world, participate in learning programs, connected learning programs that combine face-to-face with online classes, and then building livelihoods, creating access to employment, economic empowerment, supporting vocational and skills training are all really important to UNHCR's work and really important to restoring the dignity and helping refugees to get their lives back on track.
I love that phrase, the dignity of choice, giving them an opportunity to decide and prioritize their resources. Exactly. I think that's something you take for granted until that's stripped away from you. I'm curious, in your work with refugees, is there something you think that we should all know in terms of what this journey is and the challenges that they're facing, just in your interaction with this refugee population? What do you think is something that they would want, those of us tuning in right now, to know about this situation?
As I've been speaking, I've talked a lot about numbers and legal terms and programs. And I think a really important thing for us to remember is that no one chooses to be a refugee. When a person flees, they're fleeing because they have no option. They are fleeing for their life. And so we need to remember, and I think refugees would want the recognition that at the heart of all refugee crises are people. They're people just like all of us. They're people with hopes and dreams and aspirations, parents, teenagers, young children. So as we all track the issues and pay attention to what's happening in Ukraine and potentially get involved. It's Ukraine and other really complex crises around the world. We need to really remember that these are all people just like all of us.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that truly human element gets lost, right? And we're looking at policy issues and funding. Exactly. And I think what's really important to us as the policy circle community is understanding, obviously, the issues, understanding the scope and the magnitude of the challenge. But importantly, we want people to come away from reading our briefs and participating in this call with really some clear directives. And so if you were to sort of say, okay, here are some things that people can do right now, your average citizen, either to address really the humanitarian need or to look at a longer term level of assistance on helping these refugees, not just to resettle, but to really have thriving, new lives. What do you think are some sort of concrete things that people can do to be of assistance right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for that question. It's one of our favorite questions at USA for UNHCR because there really are a wide range of activities and ways to support. The first I'll mention is donating to organizations like USA for UNHCR. That really is a very impactful way to get involved. And our supporters, the donations support everything from the emergency response that I mentioned to education, to livelihoods, to protection needs, to support for gender equality and girls' education. So that wide range is where we direct support. Beyond donating, sharing stories of refugees with your family and your friends and your networks is really a great way to build empathy, to dispel myths about refugees, to help to create, to your point, Stacy, about a longer term view, to help create a more inclusive community. One way to do this is to follow USA for UNHCR on social media. that can give you some both help keep you up to date on how crises are unfolding, or how UNHCR is supporting refugee crises, as well as give you the ability to share stories. So we are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, as you would imagine. A third area I'll mention is Advocate, of course, as I'm talking to members of the policy circle to learn about policy issues, as many of you I'm sure already do, policy issues that impact refugees, and raise your voice and support. Advocacy is also a key component of our work at USA for UNHCR, and we have an advocacy section on our website. And then finally, I'll mention support for refugees in your communities. Refugees, resettled refugees, former refugees are now members of all of our communities across the United States. And this really became even more apparent as we saw in the past 6 or 7 months, nearly 70,000 Afghan newcomers and their families being welcomed into the U.S. And many local resettlement agencies have volunteer opportunities for newly arrived Afghans and others. And so that's also a really great way to get involved closer to home.
We're delighted to welcome to this Move the Needle, Natalie Gonnella-Platts. She serves as the director of the Women's Initiative at the George W. Bush Institute. In this role, she's responsible for efforts that support women and girls worldwide to lead in their communities and countries. Natalie hosts the Bush Institute's Ladies First podcast, is the co-author of A Role Without a Rule book, and has work that's been featured in a wide range of outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Vanity Fair, among others. I'm a big fan of Natalie's work, and she brings a really unique perspective to us today. When we talk about Afghanistan, you wrote a really powerful piece in The Hill stressing the importance of not leaving women and girls behind in Afghanistan. Can you share really kind of what is the latest in terms of what is the U.S. trying to do to assist these women, and what more can be done?
So I think what's really important to state first and foremost is the fact that Afghan women achieved more in 20 years than most women's movements achieved across multiple decades. They were starting from a place that was well behind where women and girls in other parts of the world were. I mean, we have improvements to make everywhere, right? But what we saw with women, especially in Afghanistan, is that they proved to be critical pillars in the pursuit of democracy, human rights, gender equity, security, education, health. Really, really critical inputs that impact not just the stability of the region within which Afghanistan exists, but our stability here at home. And that was critically important. Unfortunately, in terms of the resettlement pathways that existed for Afghans prior to the onset of the U.S. withdrawal, most pathways that were there fell within what is known as a special immigrant visa. And that category has very, very defined explanations, roles that qualify for SIV resettlement. And unfortunately, those roles are traditionally dominated by men, often very traditional military roles. You often probably hear of the interpreters and the translators who qualified in those roles. Unfortunately, once the withdrawal was announced about a year ago, there was no additional pathways. There was no expansion of that SIV pipeline to account for the incredible contributions of women in the pursuit of stability, democracy, justice, human rights. The very things that these women pushed for are the things that now put them at risk. It wasn't until the beginning of August that what is known as P1 or P2 opened up, which allowed for a subset of these at-risk women to qualify for U.S. resettlement. But again, it did not include a pathway for all of them. So women who were judges, prosecutors, police women, female commandos, those who didn't work directly for U.S. institutions, were U.S. grant recipients, or worked for U.S.-based NGOs, were again left out of that pipeline. And that continues to persist as a challenge, largely because you, for the most part, cannot get out of Afghanistan until you have a visa, but you cannot get a visa until you are out of Afghanistan. So in terms of evacuation, let alone resettlement pathways, the opportunity for at-risk women remains incredibly slim. Moreover, there are so many thousands of at-risk Afghan women who filled a number of roles as educators, as military commandos, as employees of international organizations who are still stuck in third countries. Because P1, P2, even SIV processing often takes years. And also they are in locations that are right now, quote unquote, non-US lily pad sites. So they're not military bases. Whereas we've seen an uptick in expedited processing in places like Qatar and UAE for women who fall outside of, a near complete SIV application, or who perhaps are not an immediate family member of an American citizen or lawful permanent resident. Their place in the queue and the movement of their application is much slower in some of these additional third country places. And so I wish I could say that there has been movement, over the course of the last 8 months in terms of where a lot of these women are in the queue. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case. And I think that's really a testament just to how difficult, how bureaucratic, how backlogged our US immigration system is, how difficult it is, and how resilient those seeking refuge in our country have to be, simply because the system is a difficult one. And that's not just true here in the United States, but there are Afghans who are hoping for placements all over the world who are facing similar circumstances. And in many times they are not able to work. Their children are not able to go to school. They're not able to access, adequate health, even basic health care, and are often really at the mercy of very generous individuals and host third countries who look after their day-to-day well-being. And until they know when and where they'll be able to resettle, they're not able to put the pieces of their life back together.
So how do these women, or really any refugees, but I'm just curious, especially those that you've been keeping track of, that have been part of your programming, that you guys have perhaps helped to get out of Afghanistan, who assists them with this process?
So I think one of the most inspiring things about Afghan women and really refugee women is that they're willing to do what they have to do to keep themselves and their families safe. And I think first and foremost, before we get to who is assisting them, it's really a point that needs to be driven home. And this is true not just in Afghanistan, but I think of the women, right, from Central American countries like the Northern Triangle, who, face rates of violence. 2/3 of Salvadoran women have been assaulted in their lifetime and only 6% report. And they are willing to face the reality that they will likely be re-victimized, including sexual assault and exploitation, in the journey north, because that option is better than staying where they are. And I think it's really important to understand that these are women who, again, just want to keep their families safe. So first and foremost, I think though the way in which a lot of these at-risk women maneuver these very, very bureaucratic systems comes down to their own resilience. But you have to remember too, for many of these, English is not a first language. Women from any region of the world are not a monolithic group. And that's really, really important, because the gendered specific needs of refugees often aren't considered in terms of the resettlement pathways that do exist. Moreover, resettlement agencies are so overwhelmed and do such important work that it's difficult for them to be the ones to, be a catch-all for all of the specific needs, challenges, opportunities, and barriers that refugee populations face. I think in terms of the Afghan situation, there has been such an outpouring of support from various spheres: the gender equity sphere, the veteran sphere, the foreign policy sphere, the immigration sphere. And it's been a really unique ecosystem that I think has taught us a lot of new best practices, lessons learned, has created greater networks of allyship, and have actually informed a lot of people who maybe weren't as familiar with how difficult it is to pursue asylum or refugee status here in the United States, or really anywhere around the world. I also think of, international organizations like the UNHCR, UNICEF, nonprofits like CARE and others who are doing tremendous work on the ground to try and meet the very basic needs that these folks face. In terms of Afghanistan, a lot of folks were able to leave with a backpack. And that was it. Their entire life is in a backpack. And so when we're talking about basic needs of refugees, it really comes down to food, diapers, medication, let alone all of the other things that they are having to unpack. Like, let's not forget the level of trauma they've experienced in this situation, but also for women, especially the levels of inequity that have persisted throughout their lives that they are having to grapple with.
I'd also like to welcome to our Move the Needle today, Laura Collins. She serves as the director of the Bush Institute-SMU Economic Growth Initiative at the George W. Bush Institute. She previously served as the director of immigration policy at the American Action Forum. She has experience in politics, working as a senior research analyst at the Republican National Committee for the 2012 election cycle and in the Texas House of Representatives. We are so fortunate to have both Laura and Natalie join us for today's Move the Needle. Hi, Laura.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, we are so grateful that you made time for us today. And I'm really interested to sort of look at a different aspect, if you will, of sort of the topic of refugees. You know, the Bush Institute has studied for quite some time about how immigrants and foreign workers are a really vital part of America's, economic success. And I think there's sometimes that we'll hear a narrative, perhaps, that refugees are a drain on taxpayer-funded resources, or that foreign workers would take jobs from Americans. Right? There's this narrative that sometimes can surround this issue that perhaps is confusing. And I think it'd be great if you could share a little bit with us about what you're finding in terms of how refugees and foreign workers really do add to economic prosperity and are a really vibrant part of our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the Bush Institute really does believe that America benefits from immigration. And you're right, we've done this topic from an economic perspective for a really long time, since the Bush Institute was founded when President Bush and Mrs. Bush left office. So that economic core, that idea that there is labor abroad that wants to come here and there are open jobs here that they can fill, those are really important parts of what we think about as a good, robust legal immigration policy. And some of that has to do with people's knowledge and skills and abilities. And some of that really just is about, human beings can fill jobs. We know that whether you come here because of the job offer that you have, or whether a family member sponsors you, we know you're going to work in a job, contribute to your community. And that's true of refugees as well. I think one of the broad misconceptions about immigrants is that they really qualify for a lot of entitlement benefits. That's true for refugees in a very small amount of time. To help them get on their feet, they have about 90 days worth of services that they qualify for, including SNAP benefits, basic things to help their families get on their feet. But we really do expect them to be self-sufficient, paying their own rent, paying for their own food and their utilities within that 90-day period. Occasionally, someone qualifies for a little additional help, but generally speaking, these are families that are back on their feet and providing for themselves in a 3-month time period after arriving in the United States. It doesn't mean they're necessarily thriving, but it does mean that they are contributing and that they are supporting themselves to the best of their abilities. For other immigrants, most don't qualify for any benefits. Occasionally, a state will say that there is something that they qualify for with their own funding and their own programs. But in terms of federal benefits, the only immigrants that really qualify for very much are those who are on green cards, are legal permanent residents, but only after they've been here for 5 years. So they've already been paying into the system, supporting those systems that you and I think about as being sort of big drivers of entitlement benefits like Medicare and Social Security. They pay into those systems with their tax dollars. They don't actually get any of those benefits for at least 5 years after arrival. So we know that they're here and they're contributing. We also know a lot of immigrants are entrepreneurs. A lot of them like to start businesses. We know they do it at twice the rate that native-born Americans do. That's important because those are people who are creating jobs. We know job creation in the United States is driven by entrepreneurship, small business owners. These are people who are opening up new businesses, providing a service to their communities, and also hiring other people.
We are so excited for you to hear from our next participant in this Move the Needle. Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann is a former U.S. Army Green Beret who has served tours in Colombia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He's the founder of Rooftop Leadership, where he shares the rapport building skills he learned in the Special Forces. These help today's leaders make better human connections in high stakes, low trust engagements. Scott's also the founder of Task Force Pineapple, where he actively advocates in Congress and on national media outlets for the safe passage and resettlement of our abandoned Afghan allies. Amongst his many accomplishments, Scott is a best-selling author, playwright, and actor. Today, we're going to be focused on his work with Task Force Pineapple, especially as it relates to refugees. Scott, welcome to the Policy Circle's Move the Needle on responding to refugee crises. Obviously, we started off, as I had explained to Natalie earlier, looking at this issue largely because of what had transpired in Afghanistan. And obviously now when we add the layers of complexity and the massive amount of refugees coming out of the Ukraine, this is an issue at the forefront. People are really talking about this, but this has been something on your mind and a great focus for you now for probably over a year. So I'd love to know a little bit more about you and what is Task Force Pineapple?
Oh, thanks. Good to be here, Stacy. Thank you. Well, I'll just kind of unpack it. I spent about 23 years of my life in the U.S. Army, and 18 of that as a U.S. Army Special Forces officer, or as they're often called, Green Beret. And the whole mission of Green Berets, there are a range of special operators out there, from Navy SEALs to Army Rangers, Delta Force. They have very specific missions. Most of them are direct action. So think of like unilateral surgical strike. Green Berets are a bit different. Ever since really World War II, we have a charter to work by, with, and through indigenous people and help them stand up on their own against oppression. I tell people that being a Green Beret is kind of a combination of John Wick, Lawrence of Arabia, and the Verizon guy. It's a combination of being a relationship-based connector, but there is, a level of lethality to it. But at the end of the day, we are combat multipliers that help indigenous folks stand up on their own. And we've been doing that all over the world. You're seeing evidence of it in Ukraine right now, where Green Berets have worked with Ukrainians for a decade plus. And it's just what we do. And in Afghanistan, we were some of the first in the initial invasion. Less than 100 helped move the Taliban and Al Qaeda out by mobilizing the Northern Alliance and other Pashtun tribes. And from that point on, Stacy, we started building relationships with both irregular and regular forces in the Afghan military. 20 years worth of relationships. And we also understood that, like the network, the failure of the intelligence network, the human intelligence network in Afghanistan needed to be made better. And so we put a lot of time in working with our partner forces in Afghanistan, 2 decades. And I deployed there multiple times, working again at both a village level with irregular forces and also with Afghan special operators. And what I found was just a tremendous partner force, tremendous relationships. We're raised as Green Berets to value those partners as our own blood, our own teammates. And when Afghanistan collapsed in 2021, August, it started for me by, a friend who was a former Afghan commando and special forces NCO calling me, named Nizam, saying, "Brother, I'm hiding in my house like Anne Frank right now. And I'm not afraid to die. I just don't want to die alone. And everybody's gone." And so for me, it was a friend who had been in the SIV process for a year, and just nothing was happening. And it was very obvious that this guy was one of the more iconic Afghan special operators, and there was no way he was going to survive a Taliban resurgence. So a handful of us decided to help move him across the city. I've still got the whiteboard behind me here that I first drew on that day when I made the reluctant decision to get involved in Afghanistan again after almost a decade. And we helped guide him through, and when he got right to the edge of the perimeter of the airfield, his phone was almost dead. We called into a diplomat as a final last chance to try to get somebody to let him in. And the diplomat just happened to be a former Green Beret. And he said, "We have to take care of our own. Tell him to say pineapple. That's the word of the day." And we're screaming pineapple. And then the memes started to fly when we got the selfie of him on the other side. And And then we just kept going, just like many of the other volunteer groups. Our name became Task Force Pineapple, but we were one of quite a few volunteer organizations that just tried to help with safe passage for as many as we could.
And what have you seen when it comes to trying to help some of these families that are clearly displaced? They're refugees, even if they're still in their own country, they haven't had an opportunity to even leave yet. Can you share a little bit what you're seeing on the family unit side of this?
Man, it's just heartbreaking. I mean, it's just heartbreaking. The impact on local families has been so profound. I mean, first of all, the levels of trauma that so many of these families have been through. I mean, when they tried to make a run to the airport, you had wives who were beaten, mothers and mothers-in-law who were beaten, children who were either beaten or witnessed horrific trauma, parents that had their children trampled. I mean, and all of this was in trying to get to freedom, right? It was trying to get through that perimeter at HKIA. But Natalie's absolutely right, and she is an amazing leader. And what she's done for at-risk women and girls is off the chain. But when you see the impact on the families at a local level, and particularly those, Stacy, who did not make it out, there were a lot more on our manifest that didn't make it out. There were certainly no high fives or victory laps for us. I mean, we still talk to them. We're still in touch with them. And it is just heartbreaking to see that, they can't work. They can't go back to what their former occupations were. And they're living like common criminals, moving from house to house. Now, I will say this, though, is the resilience of the Afghan people is astounding to me. The fact that they've endured 4+ decades of war and yet still have such a high level of resilience. And you don't see that because no one's even talking about it anymore. But I just got off the phone with a family, one of the Afghan partners who we were working with, and his wife was a kindergarten teacher. And they are teaching girls in home, like homeschool for girls, like in mass. The mom is teaching kindergarten again, and what they do is they move to different houses. It's like a co-op among the parents, and they're moving to different houses and they're holding school. And it's just to see that and what would happen to them if they were caught. I don't know. I've kind of lost words for it anymore. But it's just the humanity of it and the human spirit in this is just unfathomable.
Tell me about what you guys are still doing, right, Scott? What is your focus right now?
Yeah.
And importantly, sort of what is being done by this administration that either supports the work you're doing, or what support are you out there seeking?
So great question. And I'll kind of break it down like this. I'm a storyteller. I like many of the volunteers, I didn't want to be back in this work. I left government service for a reason. I retired as a lieutenant colonel because I didn't want to be around government service anymore. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a nonprofit leader that helps veterans tell their stories. I mean, for goodness sakes, but I got involved out of a friendship, as many people did. And I was going to honor this promise, even if the institutional leadership did not. And I think that at the end of the day is what brought many of us to this and what keeps many of us involved. But I can speak for our veteran population, Stacy, is that, it's been this moral injury on them. Imagine being on the world's longest 911 call. And whether you're a volunteer that's helping at-risk girls or whether you're helping at-risk commandos, there's no relief. There's no second shift, being on a call for 6-7 months at a time. And you're the only lifeline that these families have. You're their only hope. You are the person who is facilitating food drops or paying rent to a safe house. Or we've had, we've worked with one nonprofit where 20 babies have been born since the explosion in safe houses. So, there is a tremendous effort underway in the private sector for humanitarian aid, just to keep people alive. There's a few flights out, but for the most part, it's been to try to keep people alive through the winter and not be exterminated by the Taliban if you're a commando or a female judge. And I tell you, I'm in awe of what these volunteer groups have done. Pineapple has moved into a federation called Moral Compass that's like 18 or 19 special ops oriented volunteer groups. And what I'm focused on now, Stacy, is as a storyteller, is being an advocate for this. We're writing, James Meek and I from ABC News are writing a book called Operation Pineapple Express that chronicles how the volunteers honored the promise and where accountability needs to be leveled here. That should be coming out pretty soon. We're doing a lot of engagement with Congress in coordination with Moral Compass, and then just fundraising. Anything that I can do to connect people or help raise revenue or tell the story of what our Afghan partners are going through. And because, we have to get, I think, more focused in how we raise revenue and how we muster resources, because this is going to be a long game. I'll end with this to just give you an idea. We recently interviewed a guy named George, right, in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He is a Green Beret from Vietnam. But here's the thing. George is in his 80s, and he's been pulling Montagnard tribesmen out of Vietnam for years, and he's still doing it. And what I don't think people fully understand is certainly our veteran volunteers, they will never stop. They will never stop until this promise has been honored. And so how do we do that over the long haul? I think we're going to have a lot of private public conversations. And right now there's not much public to this. I'm not seeing this administration, in my opinion, provide the level of humanitarian aid that is needed. And I'm not seeing the level of movement on, for example, Afghan special ops having a pathway out of the country. So I still think there's a lot of work to be done on the government side. And believe me, this is apolitical. There's both sides need to step up.
So if you were to sort of give a charge to the people watching today and say, hey, these are 2 or 3 things that I would like for you to do to either get policymakers thinking straight on these issues or to literally be the boots on the ground in their community, what would your charge be to everyone today?
I would address it I'll address safe passage first, and then I'll address resettlement. So on the safe passage front, my ask would be anyone watching this who is an influencer or a potential influencer who could help us bring the narrative back to the fore. Like that has got to happen. I mean, this moral injury that has occurred as a result of abandoning an entire society that was on its path to a liberal democracy. The way this has gone down, this one's going to haunt us, and it's not going to let us go. It's just not. And we ignore this at our peril. And our lawmakers, our politicians, our diplomats, and our military senior leaders need to bring this back to center. And it doesn't have to be the only issue, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time as a nation. We've proven that. We don't have to be just myopically focused on one policy event in Ukraine to do the right thing in Afghanistan. And what I define as the right thing here that I believe your members could potentially help with is help us bring this to the fore, help put pressure for a humanitarian corridor, for goodness sake. That would allow particularly the most vulnerable targeted populations to have some level of respite, and for the government to take on the level of resourcing that this is an Uncle Sam sized problem. And you've got these little private groups that have cashed in their 401ks and emptied their savings accounts and they're still going, and they're not going to make it much longer. Like that's, I think, any kind of pressure that can be brought to bear for that. And of course there are other, pathways to citizenship and those things that it's probably outside my scope to speak to. But those 2 things to me are super important and could be done. And then on the resettlement piece, I believe is we need to help out these nonprofits that are doing yeoman's work for resettlement, but they're overwhelmed. And I believe they're going to need augmentation from the community. And I think just even what we did was we just checked in with them, and we got, a list of like who's coming in and what their needs were. And, we're working with those nonprofits to try to fill the gaps and to just help mobilize people. We started it with Nizam, but we're going to actually go beyond that. We just recently worked with the YMCA to get swim classes for a lot of the Afghan youth who have never been around water here in Florida, for goodness sake. Right. So there's a lot that we can do, again, to mobilize our communities. As a Green Beret, I've always been big on community and local action. And I think on the resettlement front, this thing is going to be decided at a community level. Not, policymakers can help, but the communities have got to mobilize and step up.
Well, I hope that you have found these conversations to be challenging. This is not an easy topic. As we consider the plight of 80 million plus displaced people right now, there's a lot of questions we need to be asking ourselves in terms of how did we get here? What are the things we can do in the future to avoid more of these crises? But more importantly, what can we do right now? There is a humanitarian issue here that we all need to be considering. And then we also need to think about our communities. How can we help refugees resettle so they can not only survive the ordeals that they're facing, but thrive and be vibrant, contributing members of American society? So I am grateful for the time of all of our panelists. You'll see a number of resources in our brief that you can dig into, learn more about the issue, and take action. At the Policy Circle, we are about being informed and equipped so that we can be more impactful and effective civic leaders. If you're interested in the Policy Circle, if you'd like to join us, please click on the website, look at different opportunities to get engaged and plugged in. We would love to have you join our growing, thriving community of civic-minded women. Thanks again for tuning in.